Encryption keeps millions of people across the world safe, and it's doing that every day.
Millions of Ukrainians have downloaded end-to-end encrypted apps to message loved ones and share their stories with the world.
Safety is the most important thing for Ukrainians.
Encryption is playing a key role in keeping women safe when their reproductive rights are being eroded.
Encryption is safety.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome again to the Global Encryption Day 2023 Summit, Power to the People. I'm going to be hosting the second panel today, Life in a World of Scanning. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. We're hosting the summit on Zoom events, and this is a webinar. Everyone who's going to be attending today will not be on camera and will not be able to speak, but you can use the chat function. It's available on the right-hand side of your screen. Please make sure to add comments and questions on chat. The summit will be presented in English, but simultaneous interpretation is available in French and Spanish. You can choose your language by clicking on the globe icon below your screen. Closed captions are also available in English, Spanish, and French. Please select your preferred language in the closed caption icon below. So with that, please let me invite Robin Wilton to give us an overview of client-side scanning as an issue. If I could take a moment to introduce Robin. Robin Wilton is the Director of Internet Trust at the Internet Society. He's been working within the information technology industry since 1985, having worked on banking systems, encryption, and information technology security. Since 2000, he's focused on digital identity, privacy, and policy issues, and he's been with ISOC since 2012, focusing on tech and policy factors that make the internet trustworthy. Over to you, Robin.
Thanks so much, Niti. Yes, so I want to set the scene by talking a little bit about what we mean when we talk about client-side scanning and why it's problematic or potentially problematic. But to understand what client-side scanning is, we first, I think, need to understand how it fits into the general scheme of encryption as a system. What I mean by that is, if you have two people who are talking to each other over an encrypted link, in principle, no one can see what they're saying to each other. That link is effectively a secure pipeline between those two people. Now, in practice, the way the internet works is those two people are never talking directly to each other. Their traffic is always going through at least one intermediary and usually several intermediaries. So, for example, your ISP, your chat server, your instant messaging server, and so on. There's always an intermediary. Now, from a government perspective, that has always been very useful, because even in the pre-digital age, if you think of what governments used to do when we sent our letters through post offices, or what they used to do when we made telephone calls through a telephone exchange, was that if they were concerned about what people were writing or saying to each other, they always had a point at which they could intercept that traffic. And even in the 20th century, for example, there have been governments that had systematic approaches to steaming letters open, reading the contents, and resealing the envelope and sending them on. So in the digital world, that has often been the case. There has generally been an intermediary on whom governments can place a liability to open people's traffic up if the government wanted it. Then we move forward to the arrival of so-called end-to-end encryption. And what that means is that even if the traffic between the legendary Alice and Bob passes through an intermediary, only Alice and Bob have the keys to unlock that traffic. Even the intermediary can't open the contents and see what's inside. So that's the end-to-end part. Now, what that has done for governments is it has created a black box, the contents of which they cannot inspect, even if they put pressure on the intermediary. So the idea of client-side scanning is a government response, law enforcement response to the existence of that black box by saying, if we can't see what's inside that, we want access to the contents either before they go into it or after they come out of it. So client-side scanning is the process of inspecting what you write or send, either before you encrypt it for transmission or after it is decrypted on receipt. One Dutch newspaper put it like this: instead of steaming open the envelope at the post office, client-side scanning is like reading the letter over your shoulder as you write it. And I think that gives us a very strong indication as to why it is a problematic technology. Why is it being proposed? Well, one of the arguments about client-side scanning is what Susan Landau has described as a cynical ploy. When governments say, we think that client-side scanning is the best way to identify illegal content, what they tend to say as well is, oh, by the way, we're not touching or weakening the encryption. In other words, they're not doing anything to what's inside the black box. They are simply shifting the point of surveillance to somewhere outside the black box. So the cynical aspect to this is that even though they're saying we're not weakening or touching the encryption, the outcome is still the same. Alice and Bob no longer have a confidential conversation. And if confidentiality is the thing that you're valuing and the thing you're aiming for, it makes no difference to the individual whether the confidentiality is compromised inside the encryption black box or at either end of it. The outcome is the same. And I'm reminded of a very powerful statement, I think, from Paul Nemitz, which I'll use to round this short introduction off. He said, if citizens cannot have a confidential conversation, you can't have a functioning democracy. So this strikes at the root of personal freedoms. And that's why I think client-side scanning is such a threat. So Niti, I'll stop there. I think we've got a full lineup of speakers, so I'll let you carry on with the rest of the program.
Thanks a lot, Robin. Thanks a lot. Up next, I think we have Paola Bernardi. She's Senior Advisor for Policy and Advocacy at the Internet Society. She leads our work under Internet Strong and Defend topics in the Latin American region, and she's also co-leading our work on encryption. Paola, thanks so much for being here. Robin spoke a little bit about, client-side scanning as an issue. Could you perhaps take us through the threats that we see with client-side scanning and where they're emerging? What form are they taking across the world?
Yes. Hi, Nidhi. Hi, everyone. First thing, I'm very honored to be in this panel today with fantastic panelists. And I'm here to talk about, as you said, a little bit of the context on public policies and legislative landscape and approved legislation in different parts of the world that aim to scan specific materials for users' devices before they are sent or before they are received. So sometimes when we navigate technicalities related to breaking or weakening encryption, the explanations might sound a bit too abstract. And one common analogy that Robin just used as well is the concrete image of a post office. So I'll work a little bit around that. So imagine you place this sealed letter for a specific and unique recipient, and someone opens your letter before it reaches the other party in confidentiality. When we go back and think about the first attempts to weaken encryption, we look into the US in the 90s, where government acknowledged the need for encryption, but also their need to read critical information when needed. So legislative proposals were based in government having a key for encrypted communications only to be used when needed. And another approach was the use of backdoors. Around this time, when these types of proposals boiled down and lost credibility, the government lost also power over who could use encryption. Basically, encryption encryption systems have always been a black box for governments that governments want to access. So when 9/11 happened in the beginning of the 2000s, the new reason to access information and confidential information in communications was the need for encrypted communications to, quote, stop terrorism. And that has been the common argument behind legislative proposals around the world to weaken or break encryption since. More recently, the argument has evolved to another and not less important issue, that is child sexual abuse material, also known as CSAM, which has become popular and also makes the debate toxic, as it makes it very hard for organizations to argue, quote, against protecting children online. Although, to be very clear, this is not what we defend. The defense for encryption is the defense of a tool that guarantees greater safety for all people online. So when we look, for example, into the Online Safety Bill in the UK, which has CSAM as its main argument, it's a legislation that has just been approved a few weeks ago. We see one of the major countries in the world resorting to what we call, and the theme of this panel, client-side scanning. And now I go back to our post office analogy and say, imagine this time while you're writing your letter, someone is standing over your shoulder and reading it. This is the image of what client-side scanning is concretely. So this was a strategy, and this is a strategy used by governments all around the world that are suggesting and proposing such legislations to break confidentiality without looking like this is what they're doing. And the rhetoric used is that client-side scanning does not break encryption. In fact, the Online Safety Bill itself does not mention encryption, but it puts liability in the service providers by checking what users do in their platform, as I said, before the message is sent. So if you use platforms such as Signal, for example, and someone uses that to plan a terrorist attack, Signal might be liable. Another analogy we can use is Mercedes could be liable for reckless drivers because they built the car. So with the European Union also proposing legislations to enforce client-side scanning, we could soon be living in a life and our life in the world of scanning. And ultimately, when we talk about going against legislative proposals for client-side scanning, we are talking about the importance of confidentiality for the internet and for democracy. For example, if someone is experiencing domestic violence, the first route is a lifeline to someone they trust. If we built into the system the ability for surveillance, you are talking about taking that confidentiality possibility away, and their cries for help could be exposed to the wrong people. Going back to the child sexual abuse material argument, it is the understanding of specialists and what we have been arguing, we as Internet Society and as the Global Encryption Coalition, we have been arguing and informing governments around the world that you cannot end this by treating a symptom that has its roots much deeper into other societal issues that involve broader socioeconomic structures and go far beyond the use of online services. The goal here is not to argue around proposals to end CSAM, but to understand the impacts that governments trying to use client-side scanning as a magical tool to end certain societal issues online would end up putting everyone in greater danger and making the internet less safe for everyone. The theme for Global Encryption Day 2023 is encryption makes people powerful. And this is the message that we send to governments and that we will hear further from all our panelists today in this panel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paula. That was a wonderful roundup of the evolution of the threat, the evolution of threats against encryption, and kind of like the legislative lay of the land. So with that, and Paula's already provided us a great segue into why we're here. The goal of our conversation is really to engage with this debate and, enthuse our community, our brilliant community of internet champions, internet heroes, for advocacy around the impact of client-side scanning on the safety and security and privacy of users. During this session and with this session, we want to inform our global community about the problems with that framing and share experiences of advocates and defenders who are currently fighting the introduction of such legislation. In addition, we also hope that the panel that we have for you today will demonstrate the growing interest of policymakers globally in legislating this approach and inspiring vigilance among our community. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sabina Witting. She's a German lawyer and academic specializing in human rights, child rights, and digital technologies. She's the co-founder of Tech Legality, a boutique consultancy company which focuses on human rights and digital technology. She also holds the position of Assistant Professor for Law and Digital Technologies at eLaw, Center for Law and Digital Technologies at Leiden University. Our second panelist for today is going to be Ella Jakubowska. I hope that I got that right. She leads the advocacy at EDGI, which is Europe's biggest network of digital human rights NGOs, on the draft EU CSA regulation, where she fights for people's privacy, data, and free expression rights, and for upholding the security and integrity of digital infrastructure. She also leads the network against the use of facial recognition and biometrics by state and private actors in ways that amount to mass surveillance. And her work on both these files include policy and legal analysis, advocacy, coalition building, and awareness raising. We also are joined by Roberta Battisti, who has a master's in political and economic law from McKinsey Presbyterian University and is a graduate in law. She's the author of a book titled Regulation of Big Tech, published by Almedina. She was a researcher at Instituto Liberdade Digital and early career fellow at the Internet Society and coordinator of the working group on Internet intermediary liability at ISOC Brazil. Her research focuses on Internet governance and includes digital platform regulation, freedom of expression, and the Internet and elections. And joining us in a little while is Meredith Whitaker, who is the president of Signal. She is the current chief advisor and the former faculty director and co-founder of AI Now Institute. Her research and advocacy has focused on social implications of artificial intelligence and the tech industry responsible for it, with an emphasis on power and political economy driving the commercialization of computational technology. So with that, could I please invite Roberta, Ella, and Sabina to join us at this panel. Thank you. So perhaps I'm going to start with Ella. Ella, could you maybe talk a little bit about your experience with advocacy against existing client-side scanning proposals? What sort of bills are you involved with? And what has been your personal motivation to advocate against such proposals?
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really grateful to be in surrounded by a community of like-minded people who understand why encryption is so important, because in the work that I do, that's absolutely not a given in all the engagements that I have. So I focus very much on the current EU proposed legislation. So it's called the legislation laying down rules to prevent and combat child sexual abuse, which makes it sound like it's a law that's going to maybe do some things to protect children, maybe around investment, prevention. But in fact, this proposal has been coined chat control by many in the community because of the measures that it puts forward to implement sweeping scanning measures against potentially everybody's private communications, whether that's our Signal and WhatsApp messages, our emails, through to our cloud systems, really every way that we communicate and share information online. And this proposal has been put forward by the Home Affairs Department of the EU. But it is actually a piece of internet regulation. It's about what the responsibilities of private companies, so big tech companies, as well as privacy-friendly providers, what their responsibilities ought to be. And so even the fact that it's the proposal that's come from Home Affairs and not the department specialized in internet and tech regulation speaks to the start of a very long list of technical and legal issues with this proposal. Like the UK's online safety bill, it doesn't explicitly say that you must break encryption, but that's exactly what this EU proposal would require, and that is currently going through the legislative process, but has been deeply controversial and fortunately attracted a lot of criticism and scrutiny, quite rightly, of what it's trying to do. And maybe finally then on my personal motivations around it, I have a human rights background, and I've got some training in human rights and society and how the sociology of, or, on the sociology of technology. So I'm really deeply interested and worried about the broader trend we see in loads and loads of law and policy making about how lawmakers try to find easy tech solutions to what are actually very complex societal problems. And whilst there may be times where technology can play an assistive role, I think it's really important that we have that broader sociological and human rights perspective and awareness to see that there is never going to be a technological answer, a silver bullet to when we're talking about really serious and complex human crime.
Thanks, Ella. If I could go to Roberta now with the same couple of questions. Roberta, what sort of advocacy are you involved with? What sort of bills or proposals are you looking at? And what motivates you to really get up and fight the good fight every day?
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank you for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here in this panel with this amazing professional. And I would like to mention in advance that everything that I mentioned here is regarding at my previous work as a researcher and advocate. So to provide some context to you, Brazil is the third country in the world where people spend the most time on social networks. And here we have a significant concern about how to deal with misinformation. This is due to misinformation having a significant influence on political discourse during recent elections. And with malicious actors use messaging apps and social networks to disseminate a large volume of misleading content. In this regard, regarding the discussion about encryption is directly linked to the need to assess disinformative content. So I have worked in two cases, and I think it's important to point out that in 2015 and 2017, WhatsApp, it was blocked in the country because it couldn't provide information on encrypted messages exchange. So in the first case I worked is not a legislative proposal, but a judiciary discussion, and is related to the suspension of WhatsApp, as I was saying. And this case is under discussion in two separate actions in the Supreme Federal Court here in Brazil. In one of them, the goal is to interpret sanctions such as suspension and prohibitions of the service in the national territory. And this case raised the questions of whether the bans are constitutional or not. The case is still pending judgment, but one of the justices has already expressed that it's not possible to punish providers for failing to comply with a court order to provide the content of communications that can only be obtained by deliberately weakening privacy protection mechanisms embedded in the applications. And the second case is related to the initial draft of the Bill 2006-30, the Freedom, Responsibility, and Transparency on the Internet Bill, also known here in Brazil as the Fake News Bill. The bill is aimed at combating online misinformation and regulating social networks and private message service. In the first draft of the bill, we realized some issues that affect directly encryption, because social networks and private messaging applications would be forced to keep the chain of the communications that have been forwarded, tracking all its nodes. Regardless of the distributions of the content was done malicious at the source or along the chain. Knowing the chain of forwarded communications imply that a certain content is linked to the metadata track record, and it will be used exactly for tracking back the origin of a content that is already known. This obligation erodes key protections afforded by end-to-end encryption applications and aim at exactly ensure confidential communications. Currently, the law has undergone many changes, and after discussions by civil society and academics, this provision was removed from the text. So at this moment, I follow the legislative projects from a government perspective, but I'm always attentive to any violations that may arise. And my personal motivation was and is to develop a project on the topic to democratize and facilitate information about end-to-end encryption, because people use every day this tool, but without knowing it. And encryption can be a game changer, and that's an important tool. But to conclude, from this perspective, society would understand with knowledge and that weakening encryption would affect several aspects of security, like privacy, integrity of communication. And I really believe that knowledge needs to be shared. We need to empower our community to choose and build a better internet. We need to prepare our community to understand what are the cryptography and this importance.
Thanks a lot, Roberta. Sabina, if I can come to you with the same questions, if you could talk a little bit about your experience, the sort of issues you're involved with, and what motivates you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and having me here. Maybe let me start with my personal motivation, because it might be maybe a little bit surprising considering my background. So I come from a child protection background, and I've worked on issues around children's safety online for a long time all over the world. And of course, then naturally coming from Germany, was very interested also in the CSA proposal that Ella was mentioning, and especially the title sounded very promising because it promised that it would end child sexual abuse, and of course that is a big promise to make. But I think looking into it then, especially from a broader children's rights perspective, we increasingly got very worried about the impact that it will have, and especially I think the common narrative that Robin, also Paula mentioned already, is that we can either have children protected online, or we can have privacy. So we had all of a sudden two rights that were pitted against each other. And most importantly, it was always portrayed that only the right of to privacy of adults is at stake. But what was completely neglected is that, of course, children's privacy would also be heavily impacted by that. So I think here, one of the things that we tend to forget in this debate, and also that was seemingly not considered when this proposal was developed, is that privacy, especially children's privacy, is very, very vital for their safety. And that has also been confirmed by the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And I think this is where, you know, the proposal gets it wrong completely, because it creates the impression that privacy is a threat to children's safety rather than a precondition of safety. So this is what kind of motivated me to get more involved in this then. And I think initially what happened quite quickly is that it was portrayed as like you're either pro-privacy or pro-protection. It was two teams and you're absolute enemies. And for me, that was a bit absurd in a way, because we're all human rights defenders, right, at the end of the day. So shouldn't we be fighting all based on international human rights law? And so how can there be such a big conflict? So what we tried to do as Leiden University, we were partnering with ECPAD International, which is a big child protection organization, also with my colleague, Dr. Liza from VU Amsterdam, with the idea to bring all these human rights defenders from various areas, privacy, platform regulation, child protection, fundamental rights, and tech, together in one room to discuss this proposal, to really also understand all the various fundamental rights implications, not only for privacy, but also for children more broadly, and try to develop, based on that communication, like a consensus around what could be minimum standards. I'm not sure whether we can say it was super successful. I think there were some successes there, but I think what is very clear is that these two areas have not really overlapped before, and now all of a sudden they're portrayed as the biggest conflict when it comes to internet regulation, and that is, I think, a dangerous narrative, because it's not in line with fundamental rights and children's rights. So I think that's something we need to unpack, and I guess that's also my motivation to be involved in this piece of regulation on the EU level, because I think this, if it goes ahead the way it is drafted at the moment, will not only violate the rights of adults, but also really fundamentally violate the rights of children.
So, Sabina, thank you so much for that. And I think your intervention is very, very useful and provides a great segue into my next set of questions. So maybe I'm going to come back to you, and then we can go the other way with our speakers here. So I think the couple of questions on my mind right now are, you provided a great overview of exactly what sort of issues or what, civil fundamental rights are at stake here. So I think that's my first question. What's at stake? And, who are the people that you are advocating for? With previous interventions, even in the previous panel that was hosted by the Internet Freedom Foundation, we had a bunch of really wonderful speakers talking about exactly how these regulations are being introduced into law. Whether they're through communication law or security regulation, intelligence laws, etc. So a couple of diverse questions, but I think, what's at stake here? Who are we advocating on behalf of? And, how do you see these sort of proposals creeping in to become law?
Thank you so much for that. Let me maybe stay within the child rights lens, because I'm sure Ella will cover the broader fundamental rights concerns that come up. What's at stake, I think, the ability to communicate privately. And I think especially for children, this is extremely important in online space. And I think here, especially for children that are vulnerable, such as LGBTIQ children, who we know turn towards online communication and as a way to explore sexuality and really to develop their identity. And I think if this is being taken away from them, it will have a very negative impact on their overall development. And I think in the second question that you were asking, who are we advocating for, I think is also the question of who is being given a voice in the development of these proposals. And I think what is quite interesting for the EU proposal is that there were no children, adolescents, or young people consulted on this particular proposal. And I think that is obviously not in line with international best practice, because you should always speak to the most affected population, and that has not been done. And if children are asked for their opinion, they are only being asked whether they would like to be safe online, but they're not being asked about their privacy and their personal data. And sometimes I wonder why that is, because we don't really want to know the answer, because sometimes when we speak to children, they will tell us much more than the average adult would, that they are of course very concerned about their privacy, and they're using VPNs, and they use end-to-end encryption, and they use it purposefully. So I think we're sometimes very easily speaking on behalf of children without actually having asked them for their opinions and their views. And that is a big problem. I also think in this particular case, around the EU regulation, is really that we're trying with technology to detect forms of children's nudity in general. And what that will lead to is also that we are detecting material, but also sexual conversation between adolescents that's actually consensual and that's developmentally normal. And that is, of course, part of everyone's development, of their sexual development during teenage years. And I feel very uncomfortable with the idea of saying, well, a private sector company and government agents can have direct insights into all of these communications. We wouldn't accept that as adults. But we kind of say for children or for young people, it's okay. And I think that is very problematic because, of course, there is a stark difference between a 5-year-old and the protection levels that 5-year-old needs and a 16-year-old. And we recognize that in law in other areas, for example, when it comes to the age of consent to sexual activity. But somehow when things move online, we feel like children don't have any agency anymore. And the only thing we need to do is that they need to be protected no matter what. And this is, I think, where I get a bit suspicious then, because that's not the narrative that we usually put forward from an international children's rights agenda. So yeah, I hope that answered your question in a very, very long haul. Thank you.
More than wonderfully. Roberta, if I can turn to you with the same questions, what's at stake here? And, who are we advocating for? And at least in the Latin American context, where do you see such policy creeping in? What's the kind of language that's used very often by policymakers and law enforcement agencies?
This is an important question. So I believe the advocacy is important here, and what stakes is it's important to give a voice of the concerns of the society. We need to share these concerns with the policymakers, because the interest here is to ensure the privacy of society and also give a digital space safety. I realized the importance of this tool when I study cryptography. The relevance is go to beyond of the debate between privacy and public security. These two values are not mutually exclusive, and we need to understand this and share this knowledge with the policymakers. We need to enlighten society and congressmen about cryptography and its impact in everyday life. So I believe the role of technical specialists is to enlighten society and congressmen, and we need to empower people to use technology. The technical specialists and advocates play this crucial role to defend cryptography, promoting awareness and influencing policy and public opinion. As was saying before, the problem here in Brazil, from my perspective, is the necessity to investigate crimes related to disinformation and the elections. So we need to despolarize this debate here and provide better informations and educations for all the stakeholders in the debate. So I believe that is my response.
Thanks, Roberta. Ella, if I could come to you, Sabina had mentioned that you would be able to provide the overall fundamental rights discourse as part of your response, and that's something that everyone's particularly interested in as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would probably say when we advocate on this law, we are advocating for everyone. One of the theme of today is power to the people, and encryption is something that empowers all of us, even when people don't realize it. We do as much awareness raising as we can as EDRI with our network, but often people just have no idea not only how end-to-end encryption benefits them, but also of the laws that threaten and could jeopardize that, and if we're successful in making sure that that doesn't happen at the EU level, a lot of people will be none the wiser that they maybe could have really lost out on one of the main tenets of their digital security. So our philosophy around digital rights is, of course, we are rooted in rights to privacy, data protection, and freedom of expression, typically and traditionally, and very much committed to the idea that we all need privacy to develop ourselves, to explore different facets of our identity, whether that's our sexuality, our religion, our political views, to access healthcare, to feel comfortable being who we are and having the conversations and the interactions that we have. But of course, that's a gateway to so many other rights. It isn't just about what gets typically seen as digital rights. We very much see privacy as interconnected with rights to equality and non-discrimination, to social rights, to political and civil rights. Privacy is that cornerstone. And data also, it often sounds like something abstract, but really data about us, as we can see so clearly in the actions of big tech companies, for example, data can be used to intrude on us and manipulate us and exploit us. And that's again one of the reasons why we're so invested in this work, because for years, EDRI has been saying, we want big tech companies out of our private lives. We don't want them logging data on everything we do. We don't want them in our personal, intimate moments, our private chats. And now this proposed EU law is saying that they should be mandated to be inside those conversations, to act as a kind of internet police. There are also, of course, some people that will always be especially harmed by threats to privacy and by the loss of digital security. And that's something we're very alert to. So minoritized groups already, whether that's racialized groups, religious minorities, sex workers, undocumented people, anyone already on the margins of society, a loss of privacy can have an even more profound set of harms that come with it. But also we think about journalists, human rights defenders and activists, politicians, teenagers who are fighting the fight against climate emergency on behalf of the entire world, rely on the privacy of their communications to be able to organize. And maybe I'll make one final point there, because I thought it was really great that Sabina highlighted the lack of engagement with young people about how they feel about this. And of course, I'm not professing for what I'm going to say next to be completely comprehensive, but as EDRI and some members of the European Parliament, we wanted to call attention to how this law is very much being framed as what would be good for children without necessarily asking them. And in a survey that we commissioned of 13,000 young people aged between 13 and 18 from across a selection of EU member states, we found, for example, that 80% of them said that if their messages were being scanned, even for the purpose of detecting child sexual abuse, they would no longer be comfortable exploring their sexuality or their political views and beliefs. And so I think that really resonates with a lot of things that Sabina has said. And I really give a +1 to this idea that what we see is often only half of the debate in this almost quite disempowering sense of what privacy for children online means, because of course we need to be super attuned to this really horrific issue of child sexual abuse, but we need to also recognize that privacy is so much more complicated and multifaceted than that, and that abuses of young people's privacy are really serious as well.
Thanks a lot, Ella. And it's very interesting that you, Roberta, and Sabina have talked so much about, what this exactly means and how, privacy and security are really not binaries. In fact, I'd like to be able to not have any prying eyes on if my child's sharing their geolocation with me, for me to be able to pick them up. That's both concerning privacy and physical safety, right? So very, very great points about how they're not binaries, and Ella, very pertinent statistic there on the survey that you mentioned. And I think a fair few number of people may have already seen that. Thanks. So if we can move on and, if I could perhaps invite Meredith. Meredith, thank you for being here. I'm sorry about all of the technical loopholes that you had to jump through to be here. If I could invite you and, maybe ask you about, so we've talked a fair bit about what client-side scanning is, what the legislative landscape looks like, what sort of issues, what sort of, rights are at stake. The one question that I wanted to pick your brain about is, what is the role of technical specialists, experts, and advocates in this debate? And, with that in mind, exactly what sort of legislative or regulative proposals should the community look out for? And we do have a very vibrant community of advocates joining us today. Also to perhaps maybe touch upon your experience with the online safety bill in the UK very recently.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. And we all just learned together that you can't run Zoom from a browser if you're running lockdown mode on Mac. So lessons in corporate technology abound. I think put flatly, the role of the expert community couldn't be more important at this moment, particularly because technological expertise and tech company marketing have been so collapsed in our popular understanding of tech that I think we really need people who have an objective and non-self-interested view in this technology, making clear the long-standing expert consensus that you cannot add a backdoor in encryption safely and privately. And it doesn't mean if you call that end-to-end encryption, that's still a backdoor. If you call that client-side scanning, that's still a backdoor. If you call that, as the Washington Post editorial board did in 2017, a golden key, all of that is a backdoor. And there is years and years of evidence pointing to the fact that it cannot be done safely. Now, what we are up against right now as a technical expert community is an emerging industry of AI scanning and biometric companies that are incentivized to claim that, in fact, it is possible to do scanning of end-to-end encrypted data safely and privately. And I think what we need to recognize is this is not the 90s when, cryptographers, technical experts, and others were pushing back against, the Clipper chip and the prospect of only being able to use adulterated backdoored encryption. In the 90s, we had the tech industry on our side. And right now we have some of the tech industry, but there is an emerging industry that is actually, as we've seen in brilliant investigative reporting in the EU, is sort of counting on laws like this to put them in a place for, likely very lucrative government contracts and, other kind of mandated uses of this technology, who are making claims that are, technically infeasible. And I would say, it's 8:30 a.m. for me, or was a minute ago. So, I would say these border on lies. And, the climate we're in right now, where there is so much AI hype, so much technological hype, where claims of sentience and consciousness and superhuman abilities are being made about technological systems, we need to be very aware that this is bleeding over into this latest attempt to undermine end-to-end encryption. And we do need to stand as a technical community and call out not just government lies, but the industry that is commercializing and marketing tech in ways that are so dishonest and could be so dangerous for fundamental human rights.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Meredith. Sabina, if I can come to you with more or less, similar questions about, what is the role of technical specialists, experts, and advocates in this debate, and how can we empower our community, to be defending encryption, especially end-to-end encryption?
Thank you so much. And I wouldn't, first of all, I think I also support everything that Meredith has said. I'm not going to repeat that, but I think one of the things that's really important in this particular debate is also really the point that she made around there is an industry behind this tech. And that's the same case when it comes to child protection issues. And I think this is why we need to be extra careful of that. And I think we are quickly framing technology that serves the purpose of child protection as something inherently good that cannot be questioned. And I think that is a very dangerous approach. I think we should always be able to question technology. And I think in order to do that in a meaningful way, we urgently need specialists, tech specialists. And I think particularly in this debate, they have not been heard sufficiently on the EU level. I think there were a lot of myths that were thrown around what a safe backdoor would look like and what client-side scanning really does. And I think that is a very dangerous path, because even as a human rights lawyer myself, I wouldn't be able to really eloquently elaborate on all of these risks. So it's my role also to listen to technical experts, to learn from them, and then to apply that within a human rights framework. But I don't think that this was really the approach that a lot of people involved in this regulation have taken. And I think that is a high risk. We first need to understand the technology and then the law follows, but not the other way around. And I think sometimes we create the impression that we first define what the law is and what it should be able to achieve, and then we kind of hope that the tech will also follow that particular objective. But of course, that is not, I think, a causality that we can just leave unquestioned. Thank you.
Thanks, Sabina. Ella, would you like to come in here as well? And then just maybe in a couple of more minutes, we'll move on to questions from the audience.
Sorry, I'm having a bit of a connection issue. Was that directed at me?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, and what was the question?
Sorry, but if you're having connection issues, then I can ask Roberta and then we can come back to you. Are you okay now?
It seems to be okay. Yeah, I missed about half a minute. If you could just clarify what the question was. Thank you.
Of course, I can. So we're talking about the role of technical specialists, experts, and advocates to be able to empower our community to, be aware about and vigilant about the sort of legislative and regulative proposals that our community should be on the lookout for. I was just hoping for your thoughts there.
That's perfect then. Thank you. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to come in on this, because this is really, really close to EDRI's heart and my heart. We have offered the expertise of the EDRI network, which for those that aren't as familiar with us, we are a network of now around 50 digital human rights organizations comprising lawyers, data protection and privacy specialists, technologists, and we really wanted to have our expertise be incorporated in the EU's legislative proposal, and we tried really hard to be constructive from very early on, and we were really very much sidelined and found it deeply disappointing, not just that we were ignored, but also that we were at various times as privacy advocates lumped in with big tech and told that we are acting on behalf of big tech, when of course we fought for decades against the power of big tech to try and limit that and get back power over our digital lives. And I see that actually chimes with one of the questions that I saw in the chat. I don't know if it's okay for me to briefly engage with it.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, just a point around the problem of end-to-end encryption being used on top of messaging services on platforms that are driven by deep commercial monetization interests, I think is a really interesting question. And Facebook, for example, cannot, or Facebook Messenger and the Meta group cannot undo all of the deeply invasive stuff that they do just by putting end-to-end encryption onto Facebook Messenger. So whilst we might be glad to see them moving towards end-to-end encryption, because that will guarantee the security of conversations in a way that they cannot right now, that absolutely doesn't mean that they are off the hook. And so it kind of goes back to a point I made earlier about if the EU pushes forward with a piece of legislation that has ignored the technologists, and there have been hundreds and hundreds of technologists who have spoken up in the EU context, and the department in charge have really just said, we disagree, and haven't put forward any evidence, and there are no studies, there's no objectively verified data. And it's actually reached the point where a freedom of information request was made of the EU executive, and they had to admit that they had proposed this entire legislation on pieces of data that were effectively supplier promises that, oh yeah, this data is good, this statistic is good. It had never been verified to any extent. So whilst it's also bad enough that tech experts are being discredited and that a solution is being explored that, if anything, could give more power to big tech companies, it's also just really problematic, really dangerous from a democratic and good lawmaking perspective that we're not seeing evidence-based lawmaking, that we're not following data, we are more likely following ideology.
Thanks, Ella. And I also do see Meredith putting in some comments in the chat. So please keep that conversation going as well. So just before I turn to questions, more questions from the audience, actually, Robert, I was wondering if you'd like to come in and we can wrap up the formal part of the panel and then go to talking to our audience. Roberta?
Hi.
So just wondering how the role of advocates, and you also briefly did touch upon this, but I'm wondering if you have anything to add here.
Yes. So I believe it's technical specialists and advocates play a pivotal role in preserving and promoting the use of encryption technologies and educate the public, the government, policymakers, engage with the government officials to provide technical insights into the implications of encryption-related policies. I believe that's important, encourage innovation in cryptography, and particularly, I believe that one way to empower the society and in work, advocate for this, is explain how the cryptography is present in the society lives, the daily activities. So one of the possibility is to create campaigns driving to specific audiences. For example, in the past few years, we created and translated Internet Society fact sheets about the importance of encryption to the freedom of expression and to protect the journalists and the LGBTQI community, and use this material to run social media campaigns about the topic. I think it's not only about translating the information, but it's also involved to make it more accessible and visually appealing to the audience, In the sense, digital education is important, for digital security, and it's increasingly necessary. And as I was saying before, I really believe that we need sharing and the knowledge needs to be shared, We need to get out of the technical debate and reach the public that is directly affected by the legislation that may affect encryption. We need to implement a digital security culture. We need more information, and society will become more empowered to build a better internet, to make choice. And to conclude, from this perspective, society would understand that weakening encryption would affect several aspects of security, like privacy, integrity of communications, and others. So I believe that is the key to talk with society, and the congressman too.
Thanks a lot, Roberta. So for this part of our discussion, could I request Meredith, Ella, Sabina, Roberta to join us with your videos onto the main webinar screen, and then we can perhaps talk about the various thoughts and suggestions and ideas and questions that our audience has been putting into chat. Roberta, if you could also take a moment and join us with your video. It would really help this conversation. So perhaps I can begin with a question maybe I'll direct it to Meredith, but whoever feels like they can jump in or want to jump in with any thoughts, please do. But the question is, how do we robustly advocate for the immediate adoption of quantum resistant encryption? And this is a conversation I know you've been involved in quite a bit.
Yeah, well, Signal just launched the first step of our quantum resistant upgrade to the Signal protocol. So we're taking this very seriously, and we'll be working on the second step, which will, the first step protects against what are called harvest now, decrypt later attacks, in which an adversary could, collect the jumbled, kind of encrypted data that is at this moment illegible, and then in a future with a sufficiently powerful quantum computer, which is still TBD, they could then use that to decrypt the data. So anyone running the updated version of the Signal client on any of the platforms now has quantum resistance with when they're communicating with anyone else who's running the updated version. And in the coming weeks, every client will be updated to post-quantum. So we will also be working on the next phase of that, which will be intended to protect against a future in which a contemporaneous powerful quantum computer is able to, intercept traffic. I think this is, the predictions on when a sufficiently powerful quantum computing will be available are pretty all over the map. You have, a handful of folks saying never. You have a number of people falling in the 10 to 15 year category. And then there are, again, a handful of folks on the other side who said, well, the NSA or China probably already has it. They just haven't told us. So we aren't in a position to, or I certainly am not in a position to, sit down with the data and make my own calculation. But what we do know is if we're going to promise robust privacy to the people who rely on Signal, we do need to take this threat seriously. And we have made the upgrade. I think the answer, how do we advocate, is similar to the, overall question of how do we advocate for strong encryption in an industry and ecosystem where the business model relies on monetizing surveillance. So, we are in an uphill battle insofar as collecting all the data, creating new data, surveilling, and, so just putting that data into some unsecured database is the norm in our industry. And so I think this is less about advocating for post-quantum as like an enhanced protection on top of strong end-to-end encryption, and more about holistically fighting back against a business model that is diametrically opposed to the type of privacy guarantees that strong encryption with quantum resistance provides for people.
Thanks, Meredith. Roberta had to step away for a minute, but I hope she'll be able to join again. Sabina, Ella, just wondering if you also want to jump in, or we have other questions as well, if you'd like to come in then.
I'll answer something else, because I think Meredith said it better on quantum than I ever would.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so another question from our audience is, what is the role of the passwordless movement in the world of constant scanning? Is there an omnipresent risk surrounding the handover of authentication and encryption for, bigger internet giants? That's the question. Whoever would like to jump in, please do.
I can say a little bit, because I also, as you mentioned in the intro, I work on facial recognition and biometrics, and we do see this push in so many domains to make any sort of identity check or access to any sort of service seamless, passwordless, and we see it in so many different domains. One that I've been following for a while that really concerns me is seamless travel. The idea that you would never have to show any sort of identity document. You can just stroll through corridors that identify who you are. But of course, also deeply commercial aims also in there, and a lot of the stuff recently around this cryptocurrency. I think it's the world coin, where you enroll via a metallic orb And then you'll be able to prove yourself always using your body. Sends shivers down my spine. And I think it's all connected. And I think some of the points that Meredith has already made about the connections within the industry, we do see AI industry and lobbyists and biometrics coming together now with scanning. We've got the previously Ashton Kutcher fronted organization Thorn, who've been lobbying for this EU proposal. And it's all founded on this premise that we want things to be seamless and frictionless. And I would say, as a human rights person, sometimes a bit of friction is good. We talk about ideas around consent and being aware of what's happening with your data, who it's being shared with. The more steps we take away, the more we normalize using our faces and bodies, our biometric data, the more we normalize different forms of scanning. And without wanting to be too dystopian, I can see us really sleepwalking into a kind of world where every part of our bodies and our brains and our identity has been digitalized, and people just take it for granted that that is normal. And that can also make it harder to fight back against things like scanning your private messages, because one of the arguments I've actually heard from several people is, oh, well, Google is already violating my privacy. Facebook's already violating my privacy. So why should I care if they also scan my chats if it's going to help children? And that kind of defeatist logic that we have our digital private lives violated, so we might as well open it up and let it be even more widespread, is just the complete opposite. We want people, as scary as a lot of these things are, we still want optimism, we want hope, we want to fight for what we're protecting, not what we're against. And so being fatalistic and resigning ourselves to a digital dystopia, is not what we want here. And it all contributes.
Thanks a lot, Ella. Meredith, you want to come in here?
Yeah, just a quick note on the question of passwordlessness. I would, as always, co-sign everything that Ella has said. And I put a couple thoughts in the chat around this, but I think, passwordlessness is, of course, a danger. And I think there is caution to the technical community to incorporate the business model of the tech industry and the political economy into our thinking around these technologies, because oftentimes what I see is the presence of a hypothetical possibility or even a proof of concept, say, full homomorphically encrypted passwordlessness that does authentication without actually linking, a person's identity to their activity online. Yes, I can build a proof of concept that does that. I could even deploy it in a small municipality. But that proof of concept can often serve, I think, to blunt our criticism of these systems, because the subjunctive possibility of, we can build these systems, we could build these systems, I think distracts us from the fact that where the money is in these systems, where the business model is in linking people's identity with their activity online, then using that surveillance to sell access to people, to advertisers, to train AI models, to link that up with different government databases. So we need to back away as technical experts from just asking questions, saying, well, we could build a client-side scanning this way, which in fact client-side scanning cannot be built safely, or we could build an authentication system this way, and incorporate into our analysis always the fact that there is no real business model for building things privately and safely. Ergo, it's very unlikely that the technologies actually contracted by governments, actually built by vendors, actually deployed on populations will embody those technically rigorous high bars, not to mention that, a lot of the sort of full homomorphic encryption and other technologies are actually too computationally expensive to make them viable right now. But I do want to issue that word of caution to the technical community. We need to be much cannier in how we answer these questions and not actually let our provisional answers then be used as proof that these technologies are safe when in fact they are not.
Thanks a lot, Meredith. I think we have time to maybe take a couple of more questions. Sabina, can I come to you with a question that was put in chat a little bit earlier that talks about, how Marija, I hope I'm pronouncing their name correctly, forgive me if I'm not, they work on child safety, but also do believe in the power of end-to-end encryption, but they say that it sounds to them like end-to-end encryption is being used as an umbrella term for so many use cases and ways that it can be used on different platforms. So the kind of risk or benefit profile that end-to-end encryption creates depends on the model that each platform has. Right. So their concern is that, when it moves from a private in real life conversation to a social networking model, they work best when E2E works best when it's decoupled from discoverability, recommendation algorithms and marketing incentives. So, they're curious about your thoughts about end-to-end encryption being used on top of messaging services on social networking platforms driven by deep commercial or monetization interests.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And hi, Maria, good to see you here. And thanks for the question. So I would agree, we need a nuanced approach to these topics, and we need to understand what are the particular risks of each and every service. And I think one of the things to remember is that, especially when it comes to children's safety, unfortunately, the large majority of services that they use are monetized. So I think that's just the default. I think we need to take into consideration as well. And I think exactly because every service carries its own risk depending on the way that it's data being used, who has access to it, and so on and so forth. This is why the DSA has taken that approach of human rights due diligence. And the first step of that is that each and every service has to assess what specific risks do they have and what specific mitigation measures should they take to answer that particular risk. I think this is where the strength of the DSA lies, because we're exactly not doing like a generalization of services and that every platform has the same risks. It's really to look particularly into the mechanics of each platform. And I think here we will have to observe really what the results are of the first reports from the human rights due diligence measures that have been taken under the DSA. And I think here transparency will be very, very important to really understand these platforms better and the measures that they have taken. And I also really see here a potential entry point again for the CSAM proposal that's being putting forward, because essentially, technically speaking, it was supposed to complement the DSA. It was supposed to look at systemic risks that the platform has. And I think there are measures that the CSAM proposal could undertake that complement the overall approach that the DSA has. So, for example, to look at the specific vulnerabilities of children within human rights due diligence measures, or to really look in more detail at how do children use reporting systems and how can they be designed in a child-friendly way. So I think there's certainly a lot of room for all of that, but I think the baseline is always it needs to be looked at from a holistic child rights and human rights perspective, and this is something we cannot get away from. And I think this is where we really need to stand on what the DSA has put forward, also in terms of asymmetric obligation, because again, only because a platform, for example, has a huge reach doesn't mean that there's a huge team behind that and it's automatically big tech. So I think all of these different measures and these careful considerations that the DSA has put forward, we should carry that forward to discuss the CSAM regulation and really see what are the specific vulnerabilities that maybe the DSA hasn't sufficiently addressed and that then can be taken into consideration for that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sabina. Ella, could I come to you with the next question? I think we've already spoken about this a little bit, but there's a question in the chat that talks about, there are a lot of bodies, let's say bodies and organizations right now that have some amount of celebrity backing. How can civil society compete with tactics of that scale?
It's tough. We see, well, not only things like celebrity backing that end up with our lawmakers all fawning and taking selfies and tweeting out that this is an all-round good guy, and we don't have that kind of draw as an NGO. Also, big tech lobbyists. There's no shortage of information about how many millions of euros, dollars get spent in Brussels on lobbying from these big companies. But I think what I always remind myself, maybe to stay sane, is how much we are able to achieve as civil society. And if I take this EU proposal that's on the table right now, we've done very careful legal analysis, very careful technical analysis. And whilst it can be harder to make that heard because it doesn't seem as exciting, ultimately what I do think we're seeing is that is being taken seriously. And most lawmakers do realize that you cannot base a law on something that a celebrity tells you. And so whilst it's taken a couple of years, at least the vibe here in Brussels to me feels like the lack of evidence in the EU's proposal and the technical concerns and the legal concerns really are being heard. And there has been a real shift and a real growth of attention to why that is the case. And of course, I guess what's really gotten a lot of attention in recent weeks in Brussels is that there's been a series of alleged conflicts of interest and even alleged illegal micro-targeting of adverts against the European Commission department that are responsible for this proposal. And so that's also things like that, whilst it's pretty scandalous from a democratic point of view that that's happening, that helps to get more light onto it and to point out actually the sort of influence and potentially undue influence that some companies, some celebrities are able to have on the process. And we owe a lot of that actually to some incredible work being done by independent journalists and researchers, investigators, to make sure that we do redress that balance of power, because in some ways that's how it's always been. When you're working in an NGO, you never have the most resource, you never have the most people, the most money, but you have the belief in what you do. And in this case, we have the law on our side too.
Thanks so much, Ella. We're about 2 minutes from closing this very, very wonderful panel. I just wanted to understand if Meredith, Sabina, Ella, do you have like any last minute thoughts, 20 seconds each?
Yeah, this is wonderful. Thank you so much. I think my last minute thought will just be to echo what I've heard from so many folks here. Privacy isn't a nice to have, it's a fundamental right for a reason. And that's because it protects those who have less power from, the kind of oppression and harm that information asymmetry constituted through surveillance can enable. So, we recognize histories of surveillance states. We recognize what can happen when a, ill-intentioned boss or an ill-intentioned government or, a corporation that doesn't want you to be organizing a labor union can do when they can see into your behavior, your thoughts, your community, your network. And I think it's really important to recognize that at the center of our fight for privacy is a fight to protect those who have less power from the oppression and harm that can accrue when they are surveilled by those that have more power.
Thanks, Meredith. Sabina?
Yeah, maybe in a similar vein, I think we have heard a lot of people saying they're happy to give up part of their privacy to protect children online. And I think that comes from a great place of privilege to be able to say that. And I think that's something we need to recognize. But unfortunately, these legislations also affect the entire world, and we're aware of the Brussels effect. And I think this is why, as Meredith said, we need to really pay attention to the ones that are most vulnerable once these safeguards are being taken away. Thank you.
Thanks, Sabina. Ella, any last minute thoughts before we close?
I'll just reiterate my point about how there's no easy solution, and it's really, really hard to find out what we can do. But I do think if all the super smart people that are currently focused on defending the world from bad legislation were freed up to be able to think about better solutions, and we could all work together, at the risk of sounding like I'm being too cheesy or like I'm from the Mean Girls movie, that would actually be a lot of brain power on thinking about how can we keep children and everyone safe online in a way that upholds all of our fundamental rights. So that's what I would love to see.
Thanks so much. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for being here, for being with us on this panel. Thank you, Ella, Roberta, who had to step away. Thank you, Sabina, Meredith, and last but not the least, thank you to my colleagues Paula and Robin for opening up this panel. Please stay tuned, because we do have another really exciting session called Ciphered Frontiers, Encryption's Implications Beyond Personal Messaging, hosted by Mozilla, which is going to be on in about 8 minutes. But thank you everyone who made this panel absolutely fantastic. I will see you in 8 minutes. Please grab that coffee or tea and stay tuned. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.